Hello, this is Brian Oughton of Apologetics315. Today I am speaking with Dr. Gary Habermas. Dr. Habermas is a well-known Christian philosopher, theologian, and apologist, and has written numerous books on the subject of doubt, the historical Jesus, and most notably the resurrection of Jesus. His expertise in the resurrection studies has had considerable influence on Christian apologetics and historical Jesus studies, and his webpage is garyhabermas.com. Now, the purpose of our interview today is to get to know a little bit more about Dr. Habermas, his background, gain some insights from his experience, and to find out what he's currently working on. So thanks for speaking with me today.
Glad to be with you, Brian.
I know you're a Michigan man, but tell us a little bit about your educational background and your early influences.
Well, you're right. I grew up in the Detroit area almost exclusively. I lived for a year or so in Indiana, and I did live in western Michigan, but almost totally in Detroit in my early years, and my schooling likewise. My bachelor's and master's degrees are both from Detroit schools, the latter being, William Tyndale College, and then for my bachelor's, and then University of Detroit. And then I was living in Kalamazoo on the west side of the state while I was doing my PhD, and I drove back to the central part of the state, East Lansing, to do my PhD at Michigan State University. So I pretty much stayed in Michigan for all my education.
And what was your initial goal in your studies, and what did you focus on?
Well, undergrad, this is kind of unbelievable these days, but I had a lot of hours, and I ended up, if I remember correctly, with I want to say I had a triple major, and I also had 2 or 3 minors. So I graduated with a lot more hours than I needed. But I majored in Bible, Christian education, and I also had a major in social science. Undergrad, I studied English and speech. That was a single minor. Greek and philosophy. So a lot of areas of concentration.
That's a good mixture.
Yeah.
What allowed you to gain focus on the particular area you're working in now?
Well, it's more like, how did I get into it? Because I went through 10-plus years of doubt, and the 10 years were pretty straight and concentrated with just a couple breaks, and then more sporadic doubts beyond that. And it was trying to answer my doubts that drove me into apologetics. Now, you noted in the introduction that I kind of singled out areas like doubt and historical Jesus, and especially the resurrection. I guess I could add near-death experiences too. I've done a lot of work in that. Mm-hmm. But mostly, each of those topics came out of my years of doubt. And when my friends and family found out that I was really experiencing some tough questions, they started, they'd say, why don't you read this or study this or check this out? And of all the areas that Christians gave me to think about, I either rejected the evidences as not being very strong, or if there was a little bit of force to them, I kind of put them on the back burner because they didn't give me everything I hoped for. Now, I'm not pretending that the resurrection of Jesus is the only evidence for Christianity. It's not. But at the time, I was looking for something that could sort of hold my faith up as the strongest argument, not looking for a bunch of smaller arguments. And so I settled pretty early on the resurrection and decided that it could bear the weight of my Christian faith if it could be determined that it occurred. And I went through some really, really rocky times in that search. I actually quit my research on the resurrection for a little while because I thought I'd reached an impasse and I could, believe it by faith, but that I couldn't really answer some of the toughest questions. I mean, after years of studying the resurrection, I actually kind of walked away and thought, I won't get to the bottom of this. And then years later, I came back and found my way through that maze. So in a sense, even my interest in the resurrection was a direct response to kind of a where am I going next kind of doubt question.
Now, in your struggle with doubt, what actually brought that about, and was it the result of your studies that brought you out of that, or what was the crucial factor for you going in and coming out?
Well, I came to find out years later. I've actually done quite a bit of writing, 3 books on the subject of doubt, and I'll just mention to your listeners briefly that since you mentioned my website, 2 of my 3 doubt books are out of print, but Dealing with Doubt and The Thomas Factor, Using Your Doubts to Grow Closer to God, both of those books are on my website under the Books tab. They're free of charge. People can take them, use them, apply them however they want. But it was when I was studying doubt that I realized that most doubt is not primarily factual in nature. Mine started out that way, but it moved to other areas. And I've theorized that doubt comes in at least 3 forms: factual, emotional, and volitional. And mine went through all 3 levels. But 2 things helped me to come to the end of my doubt. One, factually, was the excellent evidence of the resurrection and making me be able to break this impasse that I mentioned earlier.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, was realizing that, to use C.S. Lewis's words, when you're struggling with doubt, you have to know where to tell your emotions to get off. I had to learn techniques for handling emotion and divorcing emotion from factual issues. And from what I can tell, in a bunch, working with a clinical psychologist buddy and doing a bunch of testing with doubters, by far the majority of doubt is emotional. Probably even non-Christian doubt is primarily emotional. So you really do need to, again, as Lewis says, tell your emotions where to get off. So it was that 1-2 punch of coming up with really good arguments for the resurrection, at least I think so, and secondly, combining it with a remedy for our unruly thinking and feeling.
Mm-hmm. Now, mentioning arguments for the resurrection, your apologetic methodology takes more of an evidential approach and looks at the historical data. Can you briefly outline what your methodology is for those who may not already know?
Sure. For those who are more advanced on apologetic methodologies, I have no problems whatsoever with the so-called classical approach that begins with God and moves on. I think that's even a fuller, more detailed sort of approach. I just don't think it's necessary. It's not 100% necessary. You can start with miracles as a sort of argument for God's existence. And in that regard, I would say the resurrection is the best approach. And the method that I sort of developed and wanted to work on in both of my doctoral dissertation and in virtually all my publications on the resurrection later, 18 of my 36 books are on this topic, on the resurrection, that is. But the ones that are do evidential studies start with a list of data which critical scholars allow. In other words, pretty much the scholarly community, wherever your allegiance lies, liberal, conservative, moderate, even skeptics, they will pretty much allow a certain body of data. Now, there'll be some differences, but there's a lot of agreement as to what's in this list. And my basic thesis, my basic method, is what I call the minimal facts method. And it says the Bible could very well be inspired. The Bible could very well be reliable or trustworthy. In fact, I think there's fantastic arguments that can be brought. But basically, the minimal facts argument says, even if you don't assume the Bible is inspired, even if you don't assume the Bible is reliable, in fact, even if the Bible is nothing but a book of ancient literature, which undeniably it is, It is at least a book of ancient literature. If that's all it is, we can use these data on which scholars agree, and there's still enough of a basis to show that Jesus was raised from the dead. And the two criteria I use for these minimal facts, the ones people hear me talking about the most, the second one, so they assume it's my most important one, but it isn't. The second one, the lesser one actually, is that the majority of scholars, a high percentage of scholars, will allow these data as facts. But the more important criterion is why scholars allow these as facts. They allow them as facts because they really can't do anything else. They allow them as facts because the reasons and the data behind the data, let's say, are so strong. So when people across a spectrum, a wide spectrum on an emotional issue like religion, agree to a list of things about Jesus, it's because the information, the evidence, is so powerful. And those are the reasons. That's the main reason for believing the resurrection evidence, is because each reason I use is backed up by a lot of different evidences. So that's the 1-2 punch. Number one, you use facts that are multiply reasoned, multiply evidenced, and secondly, that's why almost all scholars concede them. And so I start there. I don't start by saying, well, this is God's word, or, well, this is really reliable, because you'll lose half your audience. I mean, I'm not saying that that's not true. If I were pastoring, for example, like I did years ago, I wouldn't be spending all my time doing the minimal facts. You know, it's a method. You're doing what's best for the people to whom you're speaking.
What sort of skeptical objections do you find are the most common or the most misunderstood about your approach?
Oh, now that latter question, misunderstood, that's an excellent insight. Easily the most misunderstood part of my presentation, even if I'm doing this at the doctoral or master's level, is somehow, when I define the minimal facts, is those facts which are A, evidenced on a number of levels, and B, accepted as such by scholars. Students, listeners, others, people at universities, they seem to think I'm saying something like this. I'm going to use minimal facts which are attested outside the New Testament. Okay. First of all, most of these facts are attested outside the New Testament, but that is not my point. They somehow hear me saying, I'm going to use non-Christian reported material. Okay, that's not my approach for this reason. They'll say to me, excuse me, but you're using the New Testament. And I'm saying, what makes you think I'm not going to use the New Testament? What I said was not that I wouldn't use the New Testament. I said that I wouldn't assume that the New Testament was inspired or reliable. But I can still have a book, say like 1 Corinthians, that everybody thinks Paul wrote. I mean, 99% probably of all scholars now, not just people going off kind of just talking off their heads, but scholars will concede that Paul wrote that. And there's a lot of good reasons why they concede that Paul wrote 1 Corinthians. So if I start with 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and start talking about Paul, some of them will say, you're using the New Testament. And I'll say, hey, listen, I'm using the New Testament, but so do all the liberals, so do all the moderates, and so do all the conservatives. So that's probably the biggest misunderstanding, is that while you can get some data from extra-biblical sources, that's not the best evidence. The best evidence is from the New Testament. Only you simply use the things from the New Testament that are well attested. Obviously, a skeptic would not grant these things from the New Testament unless they were established on solid ground. So ask the skeptic why they use the New Testament. Same reason I do.
Mm-hmm. It seems to me as well that many people just assume this is a fallacious appeal to authority. Well, can you explain why it's not?
Sure. Great. That's a second good question. Most interviewers don't go in this much depth, and I appreciate you asking these good questions. They think every once in a while they'll say, you're using an argument from authority which is an informal logical fallacy, to which I have basically two responses. I'll give you the lesser response first. The fallacy of authority is it occurs when you cite a scholar out of their field or something that they really don't know anything about, or, well, that would be out of their field. When you cite them in areas where they haven't done very much work, or when you act like citing them solves the issue, because obviously you could cite a scholar on the other side too. So the fallacy of authority is not when you simply say, don't argue with me, the vast majority of scholars concede this point. So unless you have some specific rejections of it, don't get on my case for telling you that virtually every liberal that writes agrees with me. That's not the fallacy from authority. That's not the same thing. So basically, I'm not using the argument fallaciously. I'm not saying this solves the issue, or I'm not taking dentists, or medical doctors and what they say about the resurrection. I'm not going that route. And secondly, this is more importantly, what I said earlier about methodology, the fact that scholars concede this is my second lesser point of my method. The more important point is why scholars concede this. Sure, I say these 10 skeptics agree with me. That's just to kind of get us all on the page in considering a certain fact. If you go, whoop, stop right there. I want to know why these 10 guys agree with you. Then I'll give an argument. And I do both. I give the argument for the facts as well as saying who agrees with it. So when you give the argument for the facts, you've also broken that circle, and you're not arguing fallaciously.
Yeah, and I think also you're not saying this is true because they've said this, or it's true because... and then the other thing is, for myself, I find it helpful to think that this is just a matter of burden of proof. The burden of proof should be carried by the one who's out of the majority.
Right. Well, that's thoughtful. Well, one more thing about authority. Again, I in my endnotes in my books, many times I'll say, even a lot of skeptics allow this point, and I'll give an endnote with, say, 10 or 5 very, very skeptical scholars who concede this point. I don't say it like that solves the issue. I say it like, since 95, 98% of scholars agreed to this point, it's a good starting point. It's a good point to start our discussion why they grant this. It doesn't mean let's stop talking since these scholars agreed to it. There's nothing else to say. Mm-hmm. It definitely does not mean that. But I appreciate you bringing that up. Actually, I probably should spend more time on this type of topic, because I'd say those are probably the two areas where I'm most misunderstood, where someone does not understand why I state my method and then go right to the New Testament, because so does the most liberal critic. And secondly, they wonder if I think it's solved by appealing to authority. That's good questions, and I appreciate you clarifying that.
I want to ask you questions about your experience as an apologist. How long have you actually been teaching apologetics?
Oh, wow. I guess I have to do some math here. Since 1976, I've been teaching full-time. So what is that, about 35 years, I guess? Something like that, 34 years. I pastored before that for about a half dozen years. And then I finished my PhD, and I went right into teaching in the fall of 1976.
Let's say you're talking to someone who they're in their early education, and they're Christian, they really want to serve God, they've found apologetics and philosophy, and they think, wow, this is something I really want to get into.
Sure.
What should they consider as far as their education, and what are the implications of pursuing that? What sort of advice would you give to people coming to you asking that sort of a question?
Yeah, if I were to try to give advice to somebody who said, do we need more PhDs, where would you suggest I take this, etc., I think a lot of things come into play here, and I don't think there's an easy answer to that. For some people, they successfully pastor and mentor people, disciple people, preach on a different level. But apologetics, let's say they live in a town where there's a university and they could have a real coffee house or some other kind of ministry nearby. They could be a pastor who really gets into theology, who really gets into apologetics. Another guy might want to work on a college campus, and although he keeps up on ministry opportunities, he also keeps up on apologetics. He just doesn't, consider himself a specialist in any area, but he truly is a person who gets in there with students who are, really kind of despairing at various times in their life, or they got a bad grade, or they're away from home, or whatever, and they have to kind of mix some, people skills and psychology with it, and so on. For me, the guy that decides to go on for a PhD is a person who has the mind to do it. But I often tell my students, having a good mind is necessary, but it's not sufficient, because I think in addition to having a good mind, you have to have some other skills too. I think you have to ideally be a person who sticks with something. It's a long haul, depending on where you are in your education. If the person has a bachelor's degree, normally they're going to get at least one master's degree and a PhD. It's going to be a long haul. So questions would involve things like, do you have a family? Do you have to earn an outside living, and so on? Because it's going to take you a long time to go through this thing unless somebody can, support you. But I also would like to ask the question I raised earlier. Since most doubt is of an emotional or volitional nature, I'd like to know a little bit about that person in those terms. I'd like to know a little bit about emotionally. I would like to know, from what you know of yourself, and unfortunately too many people they don't think about where they are emotionally at all, especially men. But I would like to know what the likelihood is that they will fall by the wayside, or even be the kind of person who will be moved by some kind of problem in their life and walk away from the Lord, or just have all kinds of issues if they go away to a secular school. I mean, the catch-22 here, Brian, is that you need to pay your dues, and so if you want to be hired by a school, generally, I think you're better off with a secular PhD. But the secular PhD is what's going to push you the most, cause guys to drop out of the program the most, and most of all, we hope it doesn't cause them to drop out with the Lord. So I think all these other factors, people so often act like this is an academic thing only, and I think it's probably more about your emotions and your personality and where you are in life. Although you do have to be, like I said, relatively smart. That's just kind of the beginning.
Do you think that there are specific pitfalls that one should watch out for, and what sort of, character traits are being Christ-like should people really be mindful of in their lives?
Well, I'm no psychologist or healthcare worker, but because I've done a lot of working with people who've gone through doubts, I've had hundreds of discussions, emails or phone conversations or face-to-face when I go to universities or my own students. Because I've had hundreds of conversations with doubters, I used to take notes on just about all of them, by the way, kept a long file, and that's where some of my books come from. But because I've seen the way people respond, I think, a little different angle than some other folks, and no matter how much they say the opposite, for them apologetics equals head trip, equals brilliance, equals powerful speaker, debater, when so many of these other deals like family, personality come into play. You ask what kind of characteristics. I don't think this eliminates a person, because so many of the guys in the field have these characteristics. I can tell you, because I talk to a lot of them privately when they have issues. But a person who has an anxious type personality, a person who worries a lot, or a person who has obsessive type tendencies. I'm not talking about a psychological diagnosis. I don't have the grounds to make that. I don't have the training to make that. But somebody who tends to obsess a lot, who goes over and over and over, and no answer is good enough. They're just going to keep going over and over no matter what. I think if they tend to be really obsessive or really anxious, those are things that they can work through, and they can be very, very good at. And sometimes those kind of folks have the most to share with somebody else because there's so many in this field, and the student population, let's just take them for an example as a whole. There are so many that fight with those sorts of things. I mean, they're often your best students. The reason they obsess and they're anxious, but they obsess and they're anxious about, let's say, getting A's all the time, or doing everything the right way, or doing it like Dr. So-and-so. So they're actually, they can be very, very good at what they do. I don't think that eliminates them. I just think that we should give more warning to those kind of people and let them realize that they're getting into a lot more here than how well do you argue and can you finish your PhD.
Mm-hmm. I want to see if I can ask a question that will sort of distill down some of your advice as far as people dealing with doubt. So,
sure.
Say you only had 1 minute with someone who says, Gary, I'm just going through the worst doubt of my life. I've got to leave on this train in 1 minute. What are you going to say to that person? What would be the most key thing that person needs to hear at that point?
Well, now it depends on which of these three avenues they're coming from. So if I find out they're a factual doubter, probably the most important thing I want to say to them is major on the major. I so often hear people tell me, I mean, here's an example. I've had a couple people recently say, I can't work the creation thing out. I don't know if I'm a young earther. I don't know if I'm an old earther. I don't know where I am on this. And it's going to kill me if I don't get this thing solved. I'm saying, whoa, whoa, whoa. No matter what view you take on that subject, it's not going to kill you. No matter what view you take on that subject, it doesn't affect your eternal, outcome. I try to, if it's a factual doubter, I try to get across one thought. I'd say, what you do with the gospel, what you do with the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, that's the most important thing for you to center on. Don't get bothered by periphery questions, and don't get confused and anxious by telling yourself, there's 100 issues and I'll never get to the bottom of this. You don't have to answer 100 issues. That's what I would tell the factual doubter. The emotional doubter, I would say factual evidences are very nice, and they are necessary, but they're not sufficient to solve your issues. You have to learn how to deal with your emotions. And I would recommend a book. There are a lot of good ones out there. One I frequently recommend is by William Backus, B-A-C-K-U-S, and Marie Chapian, C-H-A-P-I-A-N. And the book is called Telling Yourself the Truth. It's published by Bethany. It's a bestseller. So I just found one in a bookstore a few days ago for $5. So it's an excellent book, but it tells people how to get a handle on their emotions. Now, I'm not a clinical psychologist. I'm not a healthcare person, but these two are. And William Backus in particular is an esteemed psychologist. He also happens to have a master's degree in theology. But if it's emotional doubter, I tell them to get a hold of a book like that. And if I had 1 minute, I'm assuming we've already talked about that. I've already told them about the book. So in 1 minute, I would say, what you need to do is think about what you're telling yourself, because psychology has shown, many psychologists have shown, that your worst pain is going to come not from what happens to you, contrary to public opinion, not from what happens to you, but from what you tell yourself about what happens to you. In other words, our worst pain often comes from how we download our circumstances. So it's not the fact that so-and-so is stepping all over us and making us feel like a worm. It's that we've bought the criticism and tell ourselves we're a worm. Or if they say we're a loser, or if they say we can't think, we put ourselves down and we say I can't think, and I act and believe like somebody who can't think. It has to do with where your emotions are. And for the majority of people, perhaps as high as 70%, many, many doubters are emotional doubters. So it's nice to have the evidences in your back pocket, but you really need to know how to deal with what you say to yourself, because that's where your worst pain comes from. That would be my message for the majority of doubters, because the majority are emotional.
Great. Well, that's very helpful. You did mention your work in near-death experiences. We don't have a lot of time, but could you tell us just kind of briefly, for those who are listening, why you chose to focus on that? work, and what sort of apologetic value study of near-death experiences has?
Well, to me, near-death experiences is sort of, you could use it either as an extension of resurrection or you could use it as a precursor to resurrection. It can play either role. A lot of people, probably the most common sophisticated objection I get to the resurrection is that's just not the way this world is. Come on, tell me the truth. Do you think there's a guy who walked out of a grave in space and time and it's only happened once? And don't you think it's unlikely that a person was raised from the dead? Well, what I kind of punt to near-death experiences at that point, the reason I do that is to show them that an afterlife is highly evidenced. There's other evidences besides NDEs, too, for an afterlife. But my argument is basically if there's an afterlife, if there's a category called afterlife, then you ought to be really, really open to an event called resurrection. So what I do when I go for NDEs, I don't take the popular sort of, we did this survey and blank percent of the people say they went down a dark tunnel and blank percent said they saw wonderful lights and blank percent saw their dead loved ones and others thought they were in God's presence and everybody agrees it was wonderful. They're not afraid of death now and they know they're going to be living forever. That's not the kind of near-death report I'm interested in. I'm interested in the dozens of evidential reports where somebody in a near-death state reports something that seems unlikely but can either be verified or falsified with a little bit of research. Something that happened outside the hospital, on a different floor of the hospital, if your family were sitting there waiting for your operation and you talk about what went on in that room, something strange happened and you saw it, or you report an event, let's say near where you are near death. Let's say 1 block away there's a car accident, and you say as you were floating above your body you were able to say this accident. And there's no window from your house that you could have reported this car accident. Nobody was talking about it. And when you came to, you reported it. Things like that indicate for me the likelihood that consciousness extends beyond the death of the physical body. So you have this evidential factor of the NDEs just being really strong evidence, I think, in themselves. But it can either be used as a kind of oh yeah, you don't believe in afterlife? Well, then what do you do with these things? Or it can be used after you talk about the resurrection. And it shows that there's a category that is very strongly evidenced, and therefore I think the person who can't explain away the NDEs has to be more open to the resurrection.
Now, do you think that at the same time is it a good argument against naturalism just on the face of it?
Yeah, I think I've presented lectures before where I argue that NDEs, maybe you wouldn't use them as a single argument all by themselves, but they're definitely a nail in the coffin of naturalism. They are traditionally in philosophy and certain other places, for example, certain kinds of literary works, let's say Dostoevsky, for example, oftentimes people realize that the most important factors in a religious worldview would be God and an afterlife, and what your relationship to those things would be. For example, if you believe in God, should he be worshipped? Does he have a moral code? Is there something I should be doing, such as follow him? Afterlife, should we be praying? Should we be preparing in this life for another life? What about the things that I do on a daily basis for others? What's my rationale for ethics? And if you had another category, I'd put ethics in there. So God, afterlife, and ethics, those are generic religious concerns that almost everybody has who pursue the religion question. You could say, no, those things don't happen, but you still have a concern about them. So I think they're part of the general revelatory landscape, let's say, when you're talking about general religion. Resurrection, of course, would be a special revelatory claim.
Now, speaking about one of your books here, I should say that the Case for the Resurrection of Jesus that you co-authored with Mike Licona, it's just been a really great book, and I know it's been very useful for so many people.
Thank you.
If you could recommend some of what you think would be, say, your top 2 or 3 books that people would get started to get a feel for what your work is, what would you want to recommend to them?
Well, if it's historical Jesus in general, a topic you mentioned earlier, I have a book called Historical Jesus. College Press is the author. And all of these, I think, can be located on Amazon Books. But Historical Jesus for the general kind of questions about can we believe in Jesus, what do we know about sources outside the New Testament, and so on. I've got a few things in there, too, about the reliability of the New Testament, which is one of the only places I do that sort of thing. If someone asks about the resurrection, the book you mentioned, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus, Mike Licona, a follow-up, in time, the book came out a year before, but one of my 18 books on the resurrection is a book called The Risen Jesus and Future Hope. That's 03, and that's published by Rowman and Littlefield. The Case of the Resurrection is published by Kriegel. The Risen Jesus and Future Hope, only the first chapter is a severely truncated, severely condensed argument for the resurrection of Jesus. And the rest of the book, I asked the question, what follows from the resurrection being true? Earlier I said I would, say to the factual doubter, major in the gospel, major in the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. That's the thing you need to know the most. Well, this book asks, if the resurrection is true, what do we know about God? What do we know about Jesus? Is he deity? What does he require by way of salvation? What's an afterlife like? Is eternity worth aiming at? And then a few periphery questions, like how do you handle your worst pain, which has a lot of relevance. I do a lot of writing on pain and suffering, mostly because in 1995 my wife died of stomach cancer, and I had 4 fairly young children. The oldest was 21, but the youngest was only 9. And I had 4 children at home. 2 were pre-teenagers. And we just, we went through a rough time. And I wanted to ask the question, does Christianity have practical answers as well as apologetic answers? Does Christianity have, indications that it's not just true, but it can be lived? So I would say those 2 books on the resurrection. On near-death experiences, I co-authored a book with J.P. Moreland called Beyond Death. Has 3 pretty lengthy, well-documented chapters on near-death experiences. It was originally published. Well, it was published in an earlier form by Thomas Nelson. Then it was published in its present form by Crossway. And now it's available through Whiffenstock Publishers in Oregon. So those are some of the main books I would suggest on the topics we've discussed here. Besides those 3 doubt books, by the way, and 2 of them are on the website, GaryHabermas.com. The last one is a book that just came out. It's called Why Is God Ignoring Me? And it's a book about the silence of God, which is a very common and specific question about doubt.
Well, excellent. Well, we're going to link to all those books on the blog post today. But are you working on anything in particular right now or for the future?
Too many things, actually. I've had probably I think 7 books come out in the last 2 or 3 years. I have to go back and look at the dates, 2.5 years. Just had a book come out a few weeks ago on the writings of James D.G. Dunn. Bob Stewart and I edited that book. The book, Why Is God Ignoring Me, just came out. I'm doing 2 essays this summer. I've been doing a lot of chapters in books that are coming out. I've got a debate with a skeptic that's due. It's one of many debates in a book to be published by Oxford University Press. I owe that by the end of the year. I've been offered 3 very large books, up to 1,000 pages each, on a 3-volume set on the resurrection, if you can believe it. When you write, when 50% of your books, 18 out of 36, are on the resurrection, you might be real surprised to know that this up to 3,000 total pages in 3 books is, nearly as I can tell, is 80% material, 70% material, let's say, that I've never published, and as far as I know, nobody else has either. So it's pretty much all new material on the resurrection, and if I can get my act together, I've been contemplating doing this set for about 1.5 years now. It's just going to dominate my life. That's the big thing on my horizon right now, is whether I want to stop everything and do that 3-volume set.
Well, I wish you all the best in that, and I really appreciate all the work you've done and the impact you've made for so many people.
Brian, that's very kind of you. I appreciate it. And you've asked excellent questions. I've done hundreds of interviews, and I rarely get these sorts of questions, so I just really appreciate the thought that you put into this interview.
Well, thanks. Well, we've been speaking with Dr. Gary Habermas. Be sure to visit his webpage at garyhabermas.com. And as we said, all of his books and resources will be linked at today's blog post at Apologetics315, including his debates and various audio files. This is Brian Auten of Apologetics315, and thanks for listening. 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 Apologetics315, and thanks for listening.